Hello everyone, it's Abdel, and today we're going to be looking on how to create this pumpkin. We're going to start by modeling the low poly mesh, and then increasing the poly count and sculpting the fine details, and then baking those details on a normal map and a height map, and apply to the low poly mesh. I originally planned this video to be a third part to the bow modeling tutorial series, but then I thought we should model something from scratch and apply the same technique. And you can apply the same process we do here on the pumpkin. So let's get started. Right, so we're here in the new Blender scene. And we have the OSD keyboard here, shortcuts. You can follow what I'm clicking on the keyboard. I delete everything, create a new sphere, go to the orthogonal view and change the segments of the sphere to 20 and the rings to 10. This gives us 360 triangles. I'm thinking maybe we could increase, up to 12. This gives us 440 triangles as a start, which is nice. I'll have to enable proportional editing to make this smooth and easy. So let me select the middle vertices and then just hit S for scale and start scaling. You're going to see this circle, white circle, which determines the influence area of the proportional editing tool. So I'm going to move the upper point a little bit downwards, and you can see I can control this white circle diameter with the mouse wheel up and down to increase or decrease the diameter. I'm basically trying to make a rough starting shape for the pumpkin. Next, I should select the middle faces, scale them, disable the proportional editing, hit S for scale, Z, and then just type 0 on the keyboard to scale everything to the 0 on the Z axis. Scale it down a bit, and this is the area where I'm going to be modeling the stem for the pumpkin. Let's extrude upwards a bit, then inset faces with I, and then extrude again upwards. I'll do some scaling here and there. Scale the base a bit up, scale down the top of the stem. I'll be doing the same thing for the bottom. Recreate something very small, kind of like a stem as well. I'm calling it a stem right now. If anybody is thinking this is wrong, you should tell me in the comments. I'm just going to extrude it a bit, and we have this kind of a bump at the bottom and the stem on top. Next, I will be selecting every other loop to make that zigzaggy feel around the stems. So I'm just going to hold the Alt and Shift, start clicking on the loops, the edge loops, select every other one. Then when I scale them up, it's going to give us that zigzaggy feel, especially around the stems. Now, if you're following along, just scale as it is. Don't deselect the edges as I'm doing right now. I'm doing this intentionally to create a small issue, which we will talk about later. It's basically when you do certain edits on low poly meshes like these, it's gonna kind of manipulate and deform the way the UV mapping is gonna happen later, and that's gonna cause problems in texturing. I will mention them later. So I'm just gonna scale it up a little bit, excluding the Z axis. All right, we're getting close to the low poly model being done, so I'm just gonna call it pumpkin. Duplicate it, hit M, and say move to layer, and we have two identical meshes in different layers. Now I'm gonna rename this as the HP to indicate that it's a high poly model, and I'm gonna start applying some modifiers to it. So go to Modifiers tab, add a subdivision modifier. increase subdivisions up to 2. You can always keep an eye on the triangles numbers on top. It is right now saying it's around 10,000 triangles, which is fine. And we're not going to be using this mesh inside the game engine, but rather we'll add a lot of details to this one and make a normal map and apply it to the low poly mesh. So let me apply the subdivision surface modifier and then add a multi-resolution. Click subdivide once or twice. Switch to sculpt mode. And then the brush by default, if I start sculpting, you can see details. There you go. This is your first sculpt in Blender. Now I'm up in the preview, but I can see some artifacts. So let's click subdivide again. And let's try again. Nice. The stroke is much smoother, but the triangles count is at 600,000 right now. Some machines cannot handle that, so make sure your machine can. I'm gonna go to the symmetry tab and click on the X, which will deactivate the mirroring across the X-axis. And then I'm gonna up the count of the radial symmetry along the Z. And now when I sculpt, it's gonna be repeated along the Z-axis, which is what we want to make those details we need. And we can switch the stroke to a line. You can just click and drag, draw a line, and then release, and the stroke will be done. But I'm just going to switch it back to space because a line would be too ideal for something dynamic. I'm going to switch the curve of the brush, the menu presets of the stroke, which will control how the stroke looks and the smoothness of it. We will need this one. I'm just going to drag the curve a bit lower. And if I drag now, we have these sort of like creases along the pumpkin, which usually the pumpkins have. If you see in the reference picture I have right now, there's these creases. Just gonna drag from the top all across to the bottom, then switch the view, continue pushing. There we go. Don't worry about the artifacts, we can always smooth them out. Sometimes Blender does that. Now Blender is not like my go-to sculpting software. I usually use ZBrush, but Blender is free, so that's a big plus. ZBrush usually has better memory management algorithms because it uses the 2.5D technologies while Blender doesn't. That's like certain machines you can't really do any sculpting on Blender because it's heavy on the RAM. The pumpkin is looking kind of flat right now. If you look at the reference image, it has some inflation going on inside. There is a tool for that. It's called the inflate deflate brush. I'm gonna select that, hit F, and move my mouse to increase the brush size, and then just click on certain areas to give it that inflation look, kind of like pumping air inside. And you need to be careful, just don't overdo it. Blender right now is somewhat slow to respond as I'm hitting shift to try to smooth out the edges. That's because, like I said, Blender is not great with memory management with such high poly count. Next, I'm gonna try a different brush. It's called Decrease. Decrease the brush size and just touch on it to kind of emphasize these creases a little bit more. If you do it too much, the pumpkin is gonna look like a balloon. And I've done it too much. Maybe, I don't know. Does it look like a balloon to you guys? Yeah, I'm just gonna undo a bit a few times. I'll decrease the strength of the brush to make it more subtle. You know, I don't want to make a balloon looking pumpkin. And it still looks a little too round around these the center line. So let me just select the grab brush and just grab a few places around. Try to make it less round. Yeah, I think I'm happy with this. Maybe a little bit on the top. Still, right now, the line between our pumpkin and a balloon is too thin. I'm gonna select the default brush again, select subtract, and then add a texture. Make sure you're in the tools menu. Add a texture, new, then go to the textures tab in here. Select clouds. The clouds is gonna give us the rough surface that we need. It's way too strong right now. Let me decrease the strength of the brush by half. Try again. Now, if you want total randomness, you should disable symmetry on the brush so that it doesn't look like it's being repeated along the pumpkin. But I'm not going to do that, to reach quicker results. Again, this is not a sculpting tutorial, more of like a technique from baking high poly to low poly details. Just gonna keep spraying some details in there, make it as rough as possible. There we go. Now it's looking a lot less like a balloon and more like a pumpkin. Keep spraying here and there. Again, if you want total randomness, disable the symmetry. I'm happy with that. Let's switch back to edit mode and then just rotate the stem a little bit to give it a bit of a curve. Keep selecting points, rotating them around. What's nice about this is when I jump back from edit mode to sculpt mode, the details which I sculpted on earlier will be applied with the new curve I applied on the stem, which is just something nice about Blender. There you go. The stem has the details we need. Maybe I'll add a little more rotation to it, give it a more natural curve. And done. Now, before I apply the multi-resolution, I'm just going to create a duplicate and move it to a different layer, say this second layer, for example. So we have this as a backup in case we need to make any changes. I'm gonna hit apply to apply the multi-resolution to the first mesh or original mesh. And let's go to the low poly version. We still need to move it to the first layer and maybe delete this one, the duplicate, and just try to add loop cuts to this stem on the low poly and try to match it to the high poly stem. That is rotating the points around as well, and try to match the general shape of the stem. This way you can guarantee that the normal map and the height map both will be of high quality, because the closer the low poly general outlines are to the high poly general outlines, the better the baking results will be. So try to match it as closely as possible and let the normal maps do the rest for you. Great. This is looking nice. Let's move it back to the original layer. And right next, we're going to be doing a UV unwrapping of the model. So let's select these bottom edges. We don't need to select anything else from this stem. And select also the bottom edge on the bottom stem. And then select the loop going from one of these creases so that the seam is hidden. I'm gonna drag a new window and switch to the UV editor. And make sure this right panel is open by hitting N to open it. Just go to the edit mode, select everything and hit U, then unwrap. Then I'm just gonna create a new texture. Make sure the blank changed to UV grid. and then just hit OK. And we get this UV grid as a base texture. Under the shading tab, and then just take texture solid to make sure that the texture UV grid is shown. You see there's a problem. Problem being that the squares are supposed to be square. And this UV grid can show you where the deformation is happening. Right now it's happening around the center. And to fix that, we need to make it into a UV grid. The island, we need to switch it to UV grid. First, let's select the island. And then just go to grid by shape. By the way, if you don't have this plugin, it's called UV Squares. It's a free plugin for Blender. When I convert this to grid by shape, you can see that the UV grid is much more formal right now on our mesh, which is exactly what we want. So let's take everything and hit Control P. This is gonna be redistributing the islands. I'm gonna add an 0.1 margin so that the islands are separated by sufficient space. That's all we need to do for now. Let's hit File, just close this and just hit File, Export, and Wavefront OBJ. Select the destination, make a name for it. I already have these from previous testing. In the settings, make sure you tick Selected Only, Smooth Groups, and Keep Vertex Order. Just name it, export it. Next, we will export the high poly model. Make sure it's selected. It's going to take a minute to show that it's selected. Hit File, Export again, and then just choose Wavefront OBJ. Make sure the same settings are selected. Selection Only, Smooth Groups, and Vertex. Keep Vertex Order are ticked. And then just name it Pumpkin HP or something. And give it a moment. Depending on your machine, this could take a while, because there's a lot of polys to be exported. It's done. Now the next step, we're gonna need a free piece of software. It's called XNormal. It looks like it has the UI from Windows XP or even earlier, but don't let that throw you off. It's a very powerful tool. Let's there is like high definition mesh where we can load our high poly mesh, the low poly mesh to the low poly mesh, and then baking options, select the output, make sure there is 8 pixels of padding, and then the maps to render, we're going to select the normal map, the height map, and then there is the ambient occlusion, and scroll down and make sure curvature map is ticked as well. My map size is 2048 by 2048. You can choose whatever you like, and then just hit generate maps. Now depending on your machine, this could take a while as well. Just ignore that warning, just click OK. Right now it's going to start rendering the normal map, height map, ambient occlusion, and then the curvature map from the high poly to the low poly. It's going to pop up a height map. There it is. It's called the tone mapper. You can adjust those sliders. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to close, which means I agree with the current settings. And so it's rendering another map as well. Like I said, depending on your machine, it's going to take you a while. Let me jump into Photoshop. I created a new document, 2048 by 2048, a blank one. So let's jump to where XNormal baked our renders. I have the albedo already done from the previous testing, but these are the new maps. The curvature, heights, normal, and occlusion. Let's select the curvature and occlusion, both of them, drop them into the Photoshop project file. And also let's select this reference mesh picture, which I took from Google Images. You can find anyone you like, scale it and put it. It's essentially gonna be just our reference for coloring. I'm gonna take 2 samples of colors, one kinda light and the other kinda dark orange. You don't have to use Photoshop, you can totally use GIMP, which is free. So now that I sampled both colors, I'm gonna be using them. Let's go to filter, go to render, and then choose clouds. This gives us like a random texture, which would be great as a base. Now, select the occlusion map and set the blending mode to multiply and probably decrease the opacity a little bit. This is gonna give it details. We're gonna add details to the albedo channel, which will help us define the texture more. Maybe decrease the opacity a bit more. Trying to get some details, but not too many. We're going to select the curvature map, which is essentially a map where the greens are like bumps and the reds are like cavities. Select the adjustment, go to hue and saturation, and select the reds. Just go to saturation all the way down and lightness all the way down. We essentially killed the reds. If you choose the blending mode to screen, it's going to give us these highlights on the bumps, which is going to add an extra effect to the texture. Now I'm going to sample the green colors again to make another color for the stem. There we go. Select this area, go to filter, render, and clouds again. It's going to generate a similar texture for the stems, which is kind of greenish look to it. Now I'm just going to save everything as a PNG file, name it as the albedo, and hit OK. And we're pretty much done with the albedo. I'm going to fire up Quixel, which is a texturing tool. I'm not going to use it for anything, just to preview how our model looks with the maps applied to them. You can preview that inside Unity or any other engine. So I'm going to load up the normal map, the curvature map, basically all the bakes we just rendered out from XNormal, and then just assign the pre-albedo and create. And after a minute or two, depending on your machine, you're gonna get the results of the pumpkin. They look very nice, except for the weird defects that I intentionally did to emphasize on the point that you have to do the correct UV mapping of this. And everything else looks great. We have this kind of like light highlights over here, the color, except for this weird deformation of the textures. Everything else is looking very nice. We got the details nicely mapped. To show you where the problematic area is, this area right here, which is from the high poly mesh, it's looking fine, but when we go to the low poly mesh, you see the deformation in the UV grid, how it's not square at all in these areas. And that's essentially what happened when we scaled the stem and give it this zigzaggy feel without adjusting the other points in the mesh. So when you do the scale of this zigzaggy feel, make sure you scale the entire mesh, like the entire loops, instead of just limiting it to the stem. And that should solve the problem, because this is the original one I did before the tutorial, and it's looking fine. There's like, you don't see any deformation on top. So that is all the tutorial. I hope you guys liked it, and I hope you learned a lot about the high poly, low poly baking process. Let us know if you have any questions or you need any follow-ups about this tutorial, and see you guys in the next tutorial. It's been Abdo, over and out.